Welcome to the Deep Dive. Really excited about today's topic. We're plunging into a pretty significant policy decision from the Trump administration. It really reshaped how federal money was spent, specifically hitting public broadcasting and foreign aid. So our mission today, we want to unpack this for you, give you the clearest picture we can of these cuts. What actually happened, the administration's reasoning behind it, and the ripple effects, the real-world impacts. We've gathered insights from various places, congressional reports, news articles, even some constitutional analysis. Because this isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet, right? It's about how these policy decisions echo through communities, both here and, abroad. And it touches on some pretty fundamental questions about how our government works. Okay, let's get into it.
Right. So just to set the scene, these were pretty substantial spending cuts Congress eventually approved. We're talking nearly $9 billion total. And the targets were specifically public broadcasting and foreign aid. What's really interesting here, historically speaking, is that this was the first time in, decades that a president actually got a rescissions request like this through Congress.
Wow, decades. That is significant. Okay, let's focus on the public broadcasting part first. Just how big were those cuts for public media?
They were very substantial. Our sources show a cut of almost $1.1 billion from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the CPB. And that wasn't just a trim. That represented the full amount it was supposed to receive for the next 2 budget years.
The full amount. So a complete funding halt for 2 years. What was the administration's argument for taking such a, drastic step?
Well, the White House justification, according to the reports we looked at, was fairly direct. They essentially viewed the public media system as, quote, politically biased and an unnecessary expense. And it wasn't just a general feeling. What's interesting is how they used specific examples of programming to, back up that view.
Okay, like what? What kind of examples did they give?
OMB Director Russell Vought specifically mentioned shows like What Queer Ducks Can Teach Teenagers About Sexuality in the Animal Kingdom, and also a Sesame Street town hall focused on combating racism. These were held up as examples of content they felt was, let's say, out of step with their agenda. It supported their argument about bias.
Got it. That definitely pinpoints the type of content causing concern. And what about the foreign aid piece? What was the rationale there?
For the foreign aid cuts, the argument was different. The White House stated these cuts would incentivize other nations to step up, basically get other countries to do more in humanitarian crises. The position was that scaling back U.S. contributions here best serve the American taxpayer. It's a clear signal about fiscal priorities and, global burden sharing.
Okay, so that's the administration's perspective, necessary cuts addressing bias, taxpayer value. But what about the actual impact? What did the sources say happened on the ground? Because that's where you often see the real story, especially for, say, smaller public media outlets.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, over 70% of that CPB money, it goes directly to local stations. Over 1,500 of them, locally operated TV and radio. These aren't just national feeds, they're community institutions. So the prediction, and what seemed to be happening, was that these cuts would hit those smaller outlets hardest, especially in rural areas. Some stations were genuinely looking at closure.
And there's this one example that really makes it concrete. Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. She pointed out how vital these stations are up there. She called them critical alerts for tsunamis, landslides, and volcanoes. And get this, the very week the Senate was voting on these cuts, a public radio station in Unalaska, KUCB, was actually broadcasting tsunami warnings live, telling people to get to higher ground.
Wow.
Yeah. And another station, KMXT in Kodiak, was already dealing with a 22% budget cut. They were doing furloughs, pay cuts, and this station covers a huge Coast Guard base. It just highlights the essential service role they can play.
And that connects to another critical point, the impact on Native American communities. Dozens of Native American radio stations were potentially at risk. For many people in these communities, maybe over 1.5 million, these stations are often the only source for local news, for emergency alerts, even for language preservation and health info. Cable and internet can be really unreliable in some areas.
So a lifeline, essentially.
Pretty much. And the estimates were stark. Some suggested 90% of these stations could just disappear. Now, some Interior Department money was later moved around to help in about a dozen states, but many lawmakers felt it just wasn't enough. Not nearly enough.
Okay, so emergency alerts specific communities. What about just the general programming people rely on?
Well, The concern was that cuts would force stations to axe services like 24-hour children's programming. Mississippi Public Broadcasting, for instance, had already made cuts like that. And then there's the potential hit to popular shows, journalism. NPR raised specific concerns about music licensing. They pointed out something like 96% of all classical music broadcast in the U.S. is on NPR stations.
96%, that's huge.
Yeah.
And zooming out, what's the bigger picture risk to the whole system if these smaller stations start to disappear?
Yeah, the broader worry was a kind of fracturing of the entire public media system. If you lose local stations, you have fewer members paying dues, and those dues help fund the national content everyone gets. So it's a feedback loop. Stations were already making, quote, hard decisions, furloughs, managers cutting their own pay, and the feeling was that donations just couldn't possibly make up that kind of shortfall.
Right. Okay, so that's the public broadcasting side, a really complex picture. This wasn't just domestic, was it? The same package hit foreign aid pretty hard, too.
That's right. The rescission package included about $7.9 billion in foreign aid cuts. Though it's worth mentioning, an initial cut of $400 million to PEPFAR, that's the big AIDS relief program, was actually taken out. There was strong bipartisan pushback on that one.
Okay, so PEPFAR was spared, but $7.9 billion is still a lot. Which areas were targeted?
Well, it covered quite a range. Things like emergency shelter and water for refugees, humanitarian aid for disaster zones, and also programs aimed at boosting economies and, democratic institutions in developing nations.
And what was the reaction from groups involved in foreign aid? What were the main criticisms?
The pushback was pretty strong. Organizations like Oxfam, for example, warned about dire consequences. Their analyses suggested these cuts could lead to millions of children losing education access, tens of millions losing basic health care. They even projected potentially over 3 million preventable deaths annually. Really serious numbers.
Those are staggering figures. Beyond the humanitarian angle, were there geopolitical concerns voiced about, say, America's role in the world?
Yes, definitely. Opponents argued that pulling back on foreign aid could damage America's standing globally, and some explicitly warned it could, quote, create a vacuum for China to fill. It really brings up that long-standing debate. Is foreign aid just an expense, or is it a key tool of U.S. foreign policy and influence? That's the tension.
And underlying all of this, the cuts themselves stirred up some fundamental constitutional questions, didn't they? About presidential power over spending. Let's touch on that history quickly. What's the key concept here?
Right. We're talking about something called impoundment. Basically, it's when a president withholds or delays funds that Congress has already approved. It's actually not new, goes way back to Thomas Jefferson, but it really blew up into a major conflict under President Nixon in the 70s. He used it quite aggressively, critics said, to effectively block programs he didn't like, even after Congress funded them.
Okay, Nixon pushed it too far. So how did Congress react back then?
They reacted strongly. In 1974, they passed the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act, usually just called the ICA. This law created a process. It requires the president to tell Congress if they plan to withhold funds, either a temporary delay, a deferral, or a permanent cancellation, a rescission. And crucially, for rescissions, the permanent cuts, Congress has to actively approve them within 45 days. If they don't act, the money must be released. It was meant to reassert congressional control over the purse strings.
So given that history, the fact that these recent rescissions under President Trump were approved by Congress is actually a pretty big deal.
It absolutely is. It marked the first time in decades, as we said, that a presidential rescission package like this successfully passed the Senate, and it largely broke down along party lines. This sets a precedent. And adding to that, OMB Director Vought at the time suggested more rescission packages were, quote, likely to come soon. He even publicly questioned whether the Impoundment Control Act itself was constitutional.
Wow.
Yeah. So it really highlights this ongoing, push and pull between the White House and Congress over who ultimately controls federal spending.
Okay, so we've really covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at these major federal spending cuts, explored the administration's reasoning, tackling perceived bias, unnecessary costs, and then traced the impacts. From local radio stations broadcasting tsunami warnings in Alaska to potential effects on global health programs, and even these deep constitutional questions about presidential power.
Yeah, the sources definitely paint a complex picture. On one hand, you have an administration trying to implement its fiscal priorities, questioning the value of some long-established programs. On the other hand, you have many voices raising serious concerns about the real human costs, the societal impacts, and, as we just discussed, the constitutional balance.
Absolutely. And ultimately, this deep dive really underscores how decisions made in Washington can have these immediate, profound effects right across the country and indeed around the world. It leaves us with a question, really, for you listening. How do you weigh that? How do you balance the goals of fiscal conservatism with the kinds of impacts we've discussed on essential services, on global influence, especially for programs that have been part of the landscape for a long time? Definitely something to think about, isn't it?